Why do humans sometimes do things they know are completely against their own interests? Why do we choose temptation today, even when tomorrow clearly looks more important? Why does your brain repeatedly choose tiny rewards over bigger future rewards? And why can two people experience the same situation and react completely differently? The answer begins with something hidden behind almost every decision you make. Your behavior isn't random. It's shaped by systems constantly operating beneath awareness. Some forces come from emotions, some from memories, and others from social pressure. Together, these forces quietly influence what you notice, choose, avoid, and pursue. And here's the strange part. You often believe you're choosing completely freely, but your brain may have started making the decision before you consciously noticed. Your brain doesn't simply react to reality. It constantly predicts what happens next. Prediction saves energy because your brain doesn't want to analyze everything from scratch. That's why your brain sometimes reacts before you understand what's actually happening. A sudden sound can trigger attention. Before your conscious mind identifies its source, your brain would rather briefly overreact than completely miss a potential threat. This prediction system also determines which pieces of information deserve your attention. Your attention isn't a camera. It's a spotlight controlled by priorities. When you're expecting something specific, your brain becomes unusually sensitive to matching information. That's why you can suddenly notice something that was visible all along. Reality didn't suddenly change. Your attention changed what your mind selected. Many people think emotions interfere with rational thinking, but that's only half true. Emotions actually provide information about what your brain considers important. Fear can tell you something deserves attention before detailed reasoning begins. Anger can signal that you believe something important has been violated. Sadness can signal loss, and sometimes encourages reflection or support-seeking. Excitement pushes attention toward possibilities that appear rewarding or meaningful. The problem isn't having emotions. It's automatically obeying every emotion. An emotion can be real without being an accurate description of reality. A small pause between feeling and acting can completely change behavior. Psychological strength isn't emotional emptiness. It's learning what your emotions are communicating. Now, consider something strange. Humans constantly adjust behavior based on other people. You may unconsciously copy someone's posture, expressions, speech patterns, or habits. This happens partly because humans are deeply social learning machines. We learn enormous amounts simply by watching what other people repeatedly do. If someone receives rewards for a behavior, observers may become more likely copying it. Likewise, seeing consequences can teach you without personally experiencing them. But social influence becomes especially powerful when you're uncertain about what should happen. When everyone appears confident, you may assume they know something you don't. Unfortunately, confidence isn't proof that a group is correct. Sometimes the healthiest behavior is checking reality instead of simply following the crowd. Humans don't just want information from groups. They also want acceptance. Belonging can make people feel safer, understood, and socially connected. That's why people sometimes change opinions simply to avoid standing apart. The desire for belonging can become stronger than the desire to be correct. But disagreement doesn't automatically mean rejection or failure. Healthy groups can tolerate different opinions without treating disagreement as personal betrayal. Unhealthy groups often turn disagreement into identity. You're either with us or against us. Once identity becomes involved, changing your mind can feel surprisingly difficult. The brain may defend belonging even when evidence challenges an old belief. Understanding this makes independent thinking much easier to practice. Here's another uncomfortable truth. Human memory isn't a perfect recording. Every time you remember something, your brain reconstructs parts of the experience. That reconstruction can accidentally introduce details that weren't actually there. That's why two people can honestly remember the same event differently. Later information can sometimes influence how an earlier event is remembered. Your expectations also influence which details become prominent in memory. Confidence, therefore, doesn't guarantee that a memory is completely accurate. The useful lesson isn't distrusting every memory. It's recognizing human memory has limitations. Important details are sometimes worth checking against reliable external evidence. Admitting uncertainty can be more rational than pretending perfect certainty. A huge portion of everyday behavior happens through habits rather than deliberate decisions. Habits develop when repeated actions become associated with familiar situations. A trigger can eventually create an almost automatic urge to act. The behavior becomes easier because your brain has practiced that sequence repeatedly. That's why changing habits often feels harder than simply knowing what to change. Knowledge doesn't automatically defeat a strong environmental cue. Changing the environment can sometimes be more effective than relying entirely on willpower. Small, repeated actions can gradually become easier through consistent practice. The brain often responds better to manageable steps than enormous, abstract goals. Eventually, repeated behavior can require less conscious effort. Now we reach one of the biggest forces behind everyday decision-making. Immediate rewards often feel psychologically stronger than rewards arriving much later. The future is abstract, but the immediate reward is physically present. Waiting requires patience, because your brain must value something it cannot experience yet. This helps explain why distractions can defeat intentions despite strong long-term goals. Modern environments can make immediate rewards extremely easy to access. Reducing distractions changes the decision environment before temptation even appears. Adding immediate satisfaction can make useful behaviors easier to repeat. Long-term goals become easier when progress itself provides meaningful feedback. The trick isn't eliminating rewards, it's designing better rewards. Your brain also uses shortcuts that can systematically distort your judgment. These mental shortcuts are useful, but they can produce predictable mistakes. One important bias makes people notice evidence supporting what they already believe. Contradictory evidence may receive less attention because it creates psychological discomfort. Changing your mind can feel personally threatening when beliefs become connected to identity. A useful defense is deliberately searching for information that could prove you wrong. Another shortcut makes memorable events seem more common than they actually are. If something is vivid and memorable, your brain may overestimate its probability. Statistics can feel less convincing than vivid personal experiences. Good judgment requires knowing when intuition needs evidence. Humans form impressions surprisingly quickly, often before enough information exists. Facial expressions, voice, posture, and context all influence those early judgments. The danger is treating a first impression like a complete personality assessment. People behave differently across situations, relationships, stress levels, and environments. One action rarely tells you everything about someone's character. Repeated patterns provide stronger evidence than isolated moments. A little curiosity can protect you from premature conclusions. Instead of asking, "What are they like?" ask, "What happened here?" Context often explains behavior that initially looks confusing or unreasonable. Understanding behavior requires more patience than judging behavior. Lying is another behavior that becomes easier to understand through human motives. People may hide information to avoid consequences, protect themselves, or influence others. Fear can make immediate honesty feel more dangerous than future consequences. Sometimes people also believe they're protecting someone from unnecessary discomfort. The motive behind deception can matter as much as the behavior itself, but detecting deception from one gesture or facial movement is unreliable. Nervousness can come from anxiety, embarrassment, uncertainty, or many other causes. Behavior becomes more informative when you consider patterns and surrounding circumstances. Psychology works best when curiosity replaces simplistic body language myths. Understanding people requires evidence, context, and humility. Procrastination isn't always laziness. Often, it's emotional avoidance. A difficult task can trigger boredom, uncertainty, frustration, or fear of failure. Your brain then searches for something that immediately feels easier. The distraction provides short-term emotional relief, reinforcing the avoidance. Unfortunately, avoiding the task usually makes the future emotional cost larger. Reducing the first step can lower the psychological barrier to beginning. Once started, the task often feels less threatening than imagined. Momentum can become more useful than waiting for perfect motivation. Environment design can also reduce opportunities for automatic avoidance. The goal isn't heroic discipline, it's making useful behavior easier. Humans are unusually sensitive to social rejection because relationships matter deeply. Even imagined rejection can produce strong emotional reactions. Your brain can interpret social exclusion as something requiring immediate attention. That fear can sometimes make people sacrifice authenticity to gain acceptance. But not every group is compatible with every person. Healthy belonging doesn't require constantly pretending to be someone else. Strong relationships can survive disagreement, boundaries, and honest communication. Sometimes leaving an unhealthy social environment protects your ability to think independently. Belonging becomes healthier when acceptance doesn't depend on constant conformity. You don't need everyone to approve of you to have meaningful connections. Anger can dramatically narrow attention toward whatever seems responsible for the problem. That narrowed attention can make alternative explanations harder to notice. When angry, people may interpret ambiguous actions more negatively. A pause creates space for information that anger temporarily pushes aside. Creating physical and mental distance can reduce immediate emotional intensity. Perspective taking doesn't erase anger. It prevents anger from becoming the entire story. Sometimes the person you blamed wasn't actually responding to the situation you imagined. Missing information can completely change how behavior appears. Good communication gives the brain more accurate information to work with. Managing anger isn't weakness. It's protecting your judgment while emotions are loud. Humans naturally compare themselves with other people to understand where they stand. Comparison can provide useful information, but it can also distort self-evaluation. You usually see your own struggles in full and other people's highlights. That creates an unfair comparison because the information isn't equally complete. Someone who looks confident may still be struggling with completely different problems. A more useful comparison is often against your previous abilities and choices. Progress becomes easier to recognize when you measure change over time. Small improvements can become invisible when attention stays fixed on someone else's progress. Comparison isn't always harmful. Unconscious comparison is the real problem. Use comparison for information, not as a permanent verdict about yourself. Humans dislike uncertainty because uncertain situations make prediction much harder. When information is incomplete, your brain often tries to fill the gaps. Sometimes that explanation is useful. Sometimes it's completely wrong. Certainty can feel emotionally satisfying, even when accuracy remains uncertain. Intellectual humility means allowing your conclusions to remain adjustable. New evidence should sometimes change your mind instead of merely decorating your old belief. You don't need immediate certainty to make reasonable decisions. Sometimes the best decision is simply the best current decision. Good reasoning includes the ability to update when reality changes. Being uncertain isn't the same as being lost. Humans sometimes defend decisions simply because admitting mistakes feels uncomfortable. Once effort, time, or identity becomes invested, quitting can feel painful. Past investment can make future decisions irrationally dependent on previous choices, but resources already spent cannot be recovered by continuing a bad decision. A rational decision asks what makes sense from this moment forward. The past provides information, but it doesn't have to control the future. Mistakes become valuable when they improve future decisions. The goal isn't avoiding every mistake, it's learning faster from mistakes. Changing direction can be evidence of learning rather than failure. Your next decision matters more than defending your previous one. Behavior rarely makes sense without understanding the situation surrounding it. The same person can behave differently depending on pressure, expectations, and environment. Social settings can change behavior even when personality remains relatively stable. Temporary states like fatigue can also influence behavior dramatically. You may judge an action differently once you understand what happened beforehand. Behavior is often the final step of a much longer chain. Understanding that chain helps replace simplistic judgments with better explanations. Context doesn't excuse every behavior, but it can explain why it happened. Good psychology considers both personal choices and surrounding circumstances. The bigger picture often reveals what isolated behavior cannot. So, how can you actually use psychology to understand people better? First, separate what you observed from what you assumed. One behavior can have multiple possible explanations. Don't choose your favorite explanation before checking the available evidence. When appropriate, direct communication can provide information, guessing cannot. Listen for motives, goals, fears, expectations, and constraints. Patterns across time are usually more informative than isolated moments. Also ask whether the environment changed before the behavior changed. Remember that your own brain has biases too. Understanding others becomes easier when you understand your own mental shortcuts. The deepest use of psychology isn't controlling other people, it's understanding yourself. Notice what triggers your emotions before automatically reacting to them. Notice which situations repeatedly pull you toward behaviors you don't actually want. Look for patterns involving time, location, people, emotions, and rewards. Patterns reveal mechanisms that isolated experiences can hide. Once you understand the mechanism, changing behavior becomes more practical. Don't rely entirely on motivation when your environment can support the behavior. Repeated practice gradually makes intentional behavior easier. Self-awareness isn't about criticizing yourself for every imperfect decision. It's about noticing patterns clearly enough to make better choices. Human behavior is created by many forces working together simultaneously. There is rarely one simple explanation for why someone behaves a certain way. That doesn't mean behavior is impossible to understand. It means understanding requires looking beneath the obvious explanation. Ask what happened, what someone felt, what they wanted, and what followed. Those connections often reveal why seemingly strange behavior actually makes sense. And remember, these psychological forces influence you too. You aren't standing outside psychology and observing everyone else. You're experiencing the same biases, emotions, habits, and social pressures yourself. That realization is where genuine psychological awareness begins. Now think about your last major decision. Was it really based only on logic, like you probably believe? Or were emotions, habits, expectations, memories, and social influences quietly involved? You may discover that your conscious explanation was only part of the story. Every behavior has a context, even when that context isn't immediately visible. The more carefully you observe those mechanisms, the less mysterious behavior becomes. You begin noticing patterns that were previously invisible. You notice why people follow crowds, avoid discomfort, seek rewards, and defend beliefs. Then comes the uncomfortable realization. You do many of them too, and that's not a flaw. It's part of being human. Psychology doesn't give you magical control over human behavior. Instead, it gives you better questions to ask about what people do. Why did I react that way? What triggered me? What was I expecting? What reward was I chasing? And what discomfort was I avoiding? Was I choosing freely, or simply responding to what everyone around me expected? What evidence would actually convince me that my current belief is wrong? Those questions transform psychology from interesting knowledge into practical self-awareness. Because once you can recognize your patterns, you can begin changing them. And once you understand human behavior, you start noticing something fascinating everywhere. The person you're trying hardest to understand may actually be yourself.